People who caught someone lying in the most inconvenient moment. What was the lie and how did it explode? I was at my cousin's wedding, which already felt emotionally loaded because our family has a long tradition of pretending everything is fine while quietly resenting each other. The venue was one of those rustic barn places with fairy lights, reclaimed wood, and bathrooms that smelled faintly of lavender and panic. I was seated at a round table with relatives I see maybe once every 3 years, which is exactly often enough for them to still feel entitled to comment on my life choices. Across from me sat my cousin Mark, who had always been charming in a loud, overly confident way that somehow convinced people he was more successful than he actually was. For years, Mark had been telling everyone that he was a senior manager at a tech company and that he basically ran the place, which became part of his personality. He talked about stock options, executive meetings, and vague NDAs whenever someone asked for details. And nobody ever challenged him because it would have been awkward. Except I knew something was off because 3 months earlier I had interviewed someone with the same name, same age, and same resume for an entry-level support role at my company. I remembered him specifically because he bombed the interview so badly that my coworker and I spent lunch dissecting how confidently wrong he was about everything. At the time, I had assumed it was just a coincidence, because surely my cousin wouldn't lie about something that easy to verify. Fast forward to the wedding reception, where champagne was flowing and everyone's volume had crept up 2 notches. Mark was in rare form, loudly explaining to the table how stressful his job was and how he was probably going to be promoted again soon. Someone asked him what exactly he did, and he launched into a word salad of buzzwords that made absolutely no sense to anyone who actually works in tech. I felt that horrible tightening feeling in my chest where you know you should keep your mouth shut, but your brain is already sprinting toward disaster. I tried to redirect the conversation by asking about the food, but Mark kept talking, leaning further into the lie like he needed it to breathe. Then my aunt, bless her unintentional chaos, turned to me and said, "You work in tech too, right? So you probably know what Mark's talking about." The table went quiet in that way where everyone is suddenly pretending not to listen while very much listening. Mark smiled at me with complete confidence, like I was part of the script and would obviously back him up. I felt heat rush to my face, partly from the alcohol and partly from the sudden realization that I was now a supporting character in his lie. I laughed awkwardly and said something vague about how tech can mean a lot of things, hoping that would be enough to move on. It was not enough. Mark clapped me on the shoulder and said loudly, "Yeah, but you know how it is at my level, it's mostly leadership and strategy." That sentence alone would have been survivable, but then he added, "Honestly, I barely even touch the systems anymore." Without fully deciding to do it, I heard myself say, "That's funny, because when you interviewed at my company a few months ago, you said you were still doing frontline support." The silence after that felt like the air had been physically removed from the table. Mark's smile froze in place, like his face hadn't received the memo yet that everything was about to go very badly. My aunt blinked slowly and said, "Interviewed?" in a voice that suggested she already knew the answer but didn't want it to be real. Mark laughed too loudly and said I must be confused because he hasn't interviewed anywhere in years. Unfortunately for him, alcohol had also loosened my memory and my patience. And I said, "No, I'm not confused, because I remember you arguing that printers are cloud-based." My coworker, who was also at the wedding because she was dating another cousin, made the worst possible noise, halfway between a snort and a gasp. Mark's ears turned red, which I had never seen before, and he started talking faster, throwing out excuses that contradicted each other within seconds. He said he had applied as a favor. Gabe then said it was for market research, then said he just wanted to see what was out there. My aunt asked why he would apply for an entry-level role if he was running an entire department, and that's when the lie fully collapsed. Mark stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of nearby tables. He accused me of trying to embarrass him at a family event, which was technically true, but also deeply ironic. I said I hadn't planned to say anything, which was also true, and that somehow made everything worse. Voices started overlapping, with relatives asking questions Mark couldn't answer and others telling everyone to calm down. The bride's mother shot daggers at us from across the room, clearly calculating how many years she would hold this grudge. Mark finally admitted in a cracked and furious voice that he had exaggerated some things because he didn't want to look like a failure. That confession landed heavier than the lie because suddenly the room wasn't angry anymore, just deeply uncomfortable. Someone tried to joke about it, but it didn't land, and the music started up again in the most awkward timing imaginable. Mark left the reception early, claiming he wasn't feeling well, which everyone knew was code for, "I cannot be perceived right now." The rest of the night continued in a strange, emotional fog, where people kept dancing but avoided eye contact with our table. Later, my aunt pulled me aside and thanked me quietly, saying she had suspected something was wrong for years, but didn't know how to address it. My cousin, the groom, was less appreciative and told me I could have waited until after the wedding to drop a bomb like that. He wasn't wrong, but I also hadn't planned to become the truth grenade at table 7. The next day, Mark texted me a long message accusing me of ruining his life, followed by another message apologizing and asking if my company was still hiring. I didn't respond to either message because I genuinely had no idea what the correct response to that situation was. Months later, the story is still referenced at family gatherings as the incident, which everyone pretends was funny now. Mark no longer talks about his job at all, which is probably healthier, but also a constant reminder of how fragile the whole thing was. I learned that day that lies don't usually explode because someone wants to expose them, but because the wrong person happens to be sitting at the wrong table at the wrong time. I also learned that weddings are emotional minefields where honesty has a blast radius nobody calculates ahead of time. And honestly, if I could go back, I might still say nothing. But part of me knows the truth was always going to surface eventually. It just happened to surface between the salad course and the first dance, with an open bar and an audience. I caught my best friend lying at the exact worst possible moment, and it unraveled my life in a way I still don't fully have words for. At the time, I thought my life was boring in a good way, the kind of boring you earn after years of chaos. I had a stable job, a long-term partner, and a friend group that had survived high school, college, and early adulthood without imploding, which honestly felt like a miracle. My best friend Mark had been in my life since we were 13, bonded over bad haircuts, shared lockers, and lying to our parents about where we were after school. We told each other everything, or at least that's what I believed with my whole chest. When I started dating my partner, Lena, Mark was the first person I told, and he was also the loudest supporter, the guy who insisted we were endgame before I even dared to think it. Years passed, routine settled, and Mark became almost a fixture in our shared life, showing up unannounced, crashing on our couch, knowing where everything was without asking. I trusted him so completely that I never questioned it, even when small things felt slightly off in ways I couldn't articulate. The lie finally surfaced at my own birthday dinner, which somehow makes it sting even more. It was one of those low-key dinners where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen, just a few friends, decent food, and an excuse to pretend adulthood isn't exhausting. Mark showed up late, already a little flushed, talking faster than usual, which I chalked up to nerves or traffic or literally anything other than betrayal. Halfway through the night, someone suggested a toast, and Mark insisted on being the one to give it. He stood up, glass raised, and started telling a story about how long he'd known me and how proud he was of the person I'd become. I remember smiling like an idiot, genuinely touched, thinking how lucky I was to have someone who cared that much. Then he looked at Lena and said, "And honestly, I've never seen you happier than since she came into your life." Something about the way Lena stiffened made my stomach drop, even before my brain caught up. She laughed, but it was the wrong laugh, thin and delayed, like her body had to negotiate with her face first. I noticed Mark's eyes flicker, just for a second, toward her, like he was checking something. I asked casually at first what he meant by that, because he'd barely seen me in the first year we were together. He froze just slightly, the way people do when they realize they've stepped off a script they didn't know they were following. He recovered quickly, too quickly, saying he meant emotionally, not physically, like he had some deeper insight into my happiness. Normally, I would have let it go, but something about the room felt heavier, like the air itself was waiting. Later, when we were all laughing about something stupid, I noticed Lena texting furiously under the table. I didn't mean to look, but when she tilted her phone, I saw Mark's name pop up. My chest tightened in a way that felt primitive, like my body understood something my brain was still refusing to consider. I asked her quietly if everything was okay, and she said yes too fast, without looking at me. The rest of the night blurred into forced smiles and half-heard conversations, the kind where you're present but not really there. When we got home, I finally asked what was going on, expecting maybe a misunderstanding or something small and embarrassing. Instead, she started crying before I even finished the sentence. She told me Mark had been lying to me for over a year. He had told her that I knew about everything. He told her I was fine with it. He told her I had given my blessing, which is such a wild phrase that it still echoes in my head sometimes. Apparently, they had been having an emotional affair that slipped into something physical during a weekend I was out of town visiting family. What destroyed me wasn't just the affair, but the casual confidence with which he had lied about me, using my trust as a weapon. The most inconvenient moment came the next morning, when Mark showed up at our place unannounced, clearly assuming everything was still under control. He walked in smiling, joking about leftovers, acting like nothing had changed. I asked him to sit down. He laughed, but it died quickly when he saw both of our faces. I asked him calmly if he had ever told Lena that I knew about them. He said no without hesitation, without blinking, without even thinking about it. That was the moment everything exploded. Lena pulled out her phone and read his exact words back to him, messages he had sent less than a week earlier. I watched his face cycle through confusion, panic, anger, and finally resignation, all in the span of about 10 seconds. He didn't apologize right away, which somehow hurt more than if he'd shouted. Instead, he tried to explain himself as if this were a scheduling conflict rather than a complete moral collapse. He said he didn't want to lose either of us. He said he thought it would work itself out. He said he was scared to tell me the truth because he didn't want to hurt me, which is such a deeply insulting lie that I almost laughed. I asked him how long he thought he could keep pretending I was okay with being betrayed in my own life. He didn't answer that. He just stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him. The most inconvenient part wasn't the timing, though. It was realizing all at once how many memories had been quietly rewritten behind my back. Every time he'd comforted me, every joke, every shared moment suddenly felt contaminated. I kicked him out without raising my voice, which I think scared him more than yelling would have. Lena and I didn't survive that year, but we tried longer than we probably should have, dragging the wreckage behind us out of sheer stubbornness. Trust doesn't snap cleanly, it frays, and you keep stepping on the loose threads. As for Mark, he sent long messages apologizing, explaining, reframing, rewriting history like it was a draft he could still edit. I never responded. The silence felt like the only thing I had left that was truly mine. What still gets me is how confident he was that the lie would hold forever. He didn't think about timing or context or the way truth has gravity. He just assumed I'd never look closely. Catching him wasn't satisfying or cinematic or empowering. It was quiet, awkward, and devastating in a way that keeps unfolding years later. Sometimes I think about how easily my life could have continued in a comfortable lie if he'd just chosen a different sentence at that dinner. And sometimes I realize that's exactly why it had to come out then. Wrong moment, wrong lie, wrong person to underestimate. I was in grad school when this happened, and it permanently cured me of academic hero worship. There was a professor everyone adored, the kind who talked about ethics constantly and loved giving speeches about integrity. He was mentoring one of my friends who idolized him. My friend discovered an inconsistency in some published research the professor had cited repeatedly. At first, he assumed it was a misunderstanding. When he asked the professor about it, the professor confidently said the data came from a private collaboration. That sounded plausible, until my friend emailed the supposed collaborator. The collaborator responded with a single sentence: "I've never worked with him." My friend panicked and brought it to the department head, thinking there must be an explanation. The professor doubled down. He claimed emails had been lost. Then he claimed the collaborator was misremembering. Then someone checked the dataset timestamps. They were fabricated. The lie didn't explode immediately. It imploded slowly, quietly, through formal investigations and closed-door meetings. By the time the rest of us found out, the professor had resigned for personal reasons. My friend spiraled for months. The worst part wasn't the betrayal of trust. It was realizing how easily a confident lie can survive in an environment that assumes authority equals honesty. I used to work retail, and I genuinely thought I had seen every possible customer scam until this happened. A woman came in trying to return a very obviously used appliance that was well outside the return window. When I told her that politely, she immediately escalated to telling me her father had died suddenly, and she was too distraught to return it on time. I offered condolences because I'm not a monster. She wiped fake tears and said she'd been caring for him in his final days. Here's the problem. Her father was sitting in the car, which I did not know yet. But my coworker did, because she recognized him as the guy who came in every morning to buy lottery tickets. My coworker quietly asked the woman if her father's name was Frank. The woman said yes without hesitation. My coworker said, "That's wild because Frank is literally in our parking lot right now eating a breakfast burrito." The woman froze. Not fake froze. Like her brain blue screened. She said that must be her uncle. My coworker went outside and waved. Frank waved back enthusiastically. The woman bolted. She left the appliance, her purse, and her dignity behind. Frank came in 5 minutes later, asking if we'd seen his daughter. We all just stared at him. He looked genuinely confused and kind of sad. We didn't tell him what she said. I still think about that lie sometimes and wonder how often she uses it without consequences. This happened during my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, which already had that tense, fake polite energy where everyone is pretending they like each other for 48 hours straight. My brother-in-law had always seemed slightly off to me, but in a maybe I'm just overprotective kind of way, not a red flag way. He was charming in public, helpful in front of family, and incredibly careful with his words, which in hindsight should have been my first clue. The lie unraveled because of something painfully stupid: seating arrangements. My sister asked him casually if he'd told his parents about the last-minute table changes. He confidently said yes, that they were totally fine with it and that everything was handled. Unfortunately for him, his mother was sitting directly across the table and slowly stopped chewing. She didn't say anything at first, which somehow made it worse. She just looked at him like she was mentally rewinding the last 30 seconds to make sure she'd heard correctly. Then she said very calmly, "This is the first I'm hearing about any changes." The entire table went quiet in that way where even the background music feels too loud. He laughed awkwardly and tried to backpedal by saying he meant he was planning to tell them later. My sister asked him why he'd said yes then. He got defensive immediately, which is always a bad sign. He said he didn't want to stress her out before the wedding. His mom asked why he'd lied to her son's future wife instead of just saying, "not yet." He snapped that she was making a big deal out of nothing. That's when my sister stood up and said she wanted the truth about everything, not just the seating chart. Apparently this wasn't the first time he'd claimed things were handled when they absolutely were not. She asked if he'd actually called the officiant like he said he did. He hesitated just long enough for everyone to know the answer. Then she asked about the caterer payment. Same hesitation. Someone, I still don't know who, let out a nervous laugh. My sister asked him directly if he had been lying to her for months to avoid difficult conversations. He said no, but by then the word didn't even register as believable. His dad stood up and told him to stop digging. My sister started crying, but not loudly. Just that silent, shaking kind that makes everyone feel like a monster for being in the room. The rehearsal dinner ended early. The wedding still happened the next day somehow. They divorced 2 years later. She told me later that the lie about the seating chart wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing how effortlessly he lied when cornered. That moment rewired how I recognized dishonesty forever. I worked ER intake for years. I've heard everything. One woman came in claiming she was 8 months pregnant and in labor. She was panicking, screaming. We rushed her back. The doctor did an ultrasound. Nothing. No baby, no pregnancy. She doubled down, said the baby was hiding, then said we were incompetent. Her partner arrived and started yelling at us. Then the doctor pulled up records. She had done this before. Multiple hospitals. Same story, same meltdown. Security escorted her out. Her partner stayed behind. He asked quietly if it was true. We nodded. He sat down and cried. Sometimes lies don't explode loudly. Sometimes they collapse silently under fluorescent lights.